The History Things podcast is brought to you by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Visit trhistorical.com and use the promo code HISTORYTHINGS to receive 10% off your next purchase. Thanks for listening. Now let's start the show.
Are you ready?
What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the History Things podcast. I'm your host, Pat McGuire. Joining me today, as always, is my co-host with the most, author, historian, park ranger. Guys, you know him, you love him, Mr. Matt Borders. Matty B, how you doing? Welcome back to the show, big guy.
I'm doing great, Pat. Always a pleasure to be back. I'm looking forward to today's conversation and discussion. Something a little different, something that a lot of folks, particularly here in the U.S., aren't very aware of. So I'm very excited about this discussion.
That was a really diplomatic way of saying, I bet you nobody has ever heard this story before. And that's why we are very excited to tell it today. So before we get into that, the History Things podcast is sponsored by TR Historical, your one-stop shop for all your historical fan gear needs. Shop trhistorical.com. Use our promo code HistoryThings. Get 10% off your next purchase, guys. So anyway, go to trhistorical.com and pick up all your sweet history swag. So today we are going to talk about an expedition that takes place in a very wild and mysterious land that our producer Parker here hails from. If you've ever met a Mainer, you know they can't stop talking about Maine. That's and in all our years of knowing Parker, one of the stories he's often told has been a version of this one. And he got us, our guest here today, to tell a bigger, better version of it. And we are very excited. So we are here today with Patrick Calloway. He is a lecturer from the University of Maine, UMaine. I actually have a hockey jersey from you guys, so I get to say UMaine too, with a dissertation on Canadian and American history. So we are going to talk about the Penobscot Expedition. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the show, Patrick Calloway. How you doing, buddy?
I am doing great. How are you guys?
We're very good. Thanks for spending some time with us today to talk about this expedition that, like I said at the beginning, I bet you nobody has heard of. Before we get into that, why don't you tell us a little bit about you? You know, what excited you about history initially, and
what drew you to this?
Yeah, this subject, and then you know, Canadian American history.
Well, I knew I was going into history when I was in third grade, so it was never a question of what drew me. I was already there, and the question was how to do it.
All right.
So I'm actually was drawn to this by a book. It's a very well done historical fiction by Bernard Cornwell, a book called The Fort.
Yep.
And it's the story of this expedition. And really, I had not heard of it before because I'm not from Maine originally. And, you know, it's sort of an obscure corner of the time period I was interested in. And, you know, folks who know me know that I have a pretty keen sense of the absurd.
Okay.
And if you look at this expedition, some of the things that happen are just crazy. So that started part of my research, which is in the relationship between the United States and Canada, primarily Nova Scotia, from the late 18th century into the early 19th century. And there are things that are going on back and forth that nobody would ever believe. So corruption and racketeering, smuggling, you know, all sorts of really interesting stuff that really nobody has paid a whole lot of attention to.
I always knew those Canadians were tricky and up to something, you know.
Sounds like it's the Mainers who may be up
I
to
know,
something.
I was kidding. So that's awesome.
Yeah. All of the above.
I had completely forgotten, Patrick, that novel is about this expedition. I mean, you mentioned it just a moment ago, Pat, that, yeah, everybody's heard of Bernard Cornwell, and many of us have heard of the fort. I'd forgotten that it was about this expedition. So
nobody
that's
connects the
fantastic.
wires. Absolutely.
Yes, he draws very heavily off of one of the great primary sources of the time. It's a journal kept by a Scottish doctor that was there at the time named John Califf.
All right.
Which you can probably find it full text online somewhere. It's a pretty widely available resource.
Cool. All right. Well, let's get us a little bit of background. Matt and I are big context guys. We always like to set the scene. So, take us, sort of from the beginning of where would you start the story?
Right.
Everybody starts their storytelling from different places. But if we said, how do we get from point A to point B being the actual expedition, how do we get there, Pat?
Okay, I would start in 1775, and there's a couple of things that happen in what is known as the District of Maine, which was part of the state of Massachusetts at the time. Maine as a state doesn't come around until 1820.
Right.
But there's a couple of things that happen in 1775 that draw attention to the region. And the first is Benedict Arnold's expedition to Quebec. So he leads several hundred men in the late fall and winter of 1775 through the Maine wilderness all the way up to Quebec. So he used the Kennebec, which is the next river drainage down from the Penobscot, but it brings the District of Maine into consciousness in a slightly different way. Then the next thing that happens is a small expedition of American forces, mostly local, that try to invade Nova Scotia. And they make it as far as Fort Cumberland, which is on the present-day boundary of New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. And after a short engagement, the American invasion is eventually repelled. So this is a serious problem potentially for the British. Because if you have troops popping out of the Maine wilderness right at the gates of Quebec or invading Nova Scotia, this has very serious potential problems. So in 1775, the British really are not in a position to do anything about this, but it's one of those things that's sort of the mental framework that will come up with the Penobscot Expedition of 1779. So we fast forward to 1779. The conditions of the war have changed. Most of the fighting has moved down to New York. New York is the primary British base in the northern colonies. We have the Sullivan expedition against the Iroquois.
Right.
But north of that, pretty much the revolution as a combat operation has pretty well died out.
Now, Patrick, Massachusetts was pretty proud of that fact, as I understand, having kind of driven the British out of Boston in 1776. I'm glad that you bring up that there really has not been a lot going on since that point up there in Massachusetts. And that you mentioned specifically the District of Maine and how it's still part of the colony of Massachusetts, but would kind of begin to see itself as an independent entity. When does that start? Has it always kind of seen itself as its own thing?
There's really two Maines.
Okay.
If we're talking about southern Maine, down about Brunswick and south, that tends to be very closely connected to Boston and towards Massachusetts. Once you get north of that, the distances are a little bit more extreme. The interests are slightly different, and you'll see a very significant split in the politics, in the way people make a living, and in some of their commercial connections.
I believe they call that the lobster lumber line.
Seriously?
No.
Okay.
No, I always don't, because Parker always talks about Maine's like known for two things, lobster and lumber.
I can see that.
So, I would imagine that the seafood fairing industry is the closer to Boston. So I'm joking, Matthew, but it probably makes some weird sense.
Well, at the time, a lot of the commercial interests would run through Boston. A lot of the seafood interests would be more coastal. Lobstering's not an industry yet.
Right.
At the time.
That makes sense.
Right. It's still like the
lumbering's a little bit further into the future, although that's starting to pick up.
Oh.
Right in the 1760s and 1770s, once the 7 Years' War is over and people start to move into Maine, the primary interest in at least the down east coast and then in some of the river valleys is lumbering. That's part of it, but also agriculture. So the idea of farming as the way to settle land.
All right. So are they growing like the same stuff that's growing in like the more moderate temperatures of the mid-Atlantic or further south? Because I know like weather is extreme up there, especially in the wintertime. So is their crop any different than crops in the other regions of the colonies and states of the burgeoning United States?
Not really, but the scale is different.
Oh,
so
yeah.
If we take a look at things like wheat, that's going to be primarily New York and South, or cotton, which is just starting to come up online a little bit. That's going to be southern crop or tobacco. But if we're thinking of subsistence, livestock, corn, things like that, it's going to be very similar.
Okay. Yeah, because people got to eat the same stuff.
Right.
So, all right. So we're in 1779. I didn't mean to derail the topic. I am the great derailer. That's what I do. So take it away. So the British are sort of hanging around in their center of operations in New York. They told George Washington, you got to leave. I believe Maryland was involved in that somehow.
More than a little bit.
# old line state, baby. And Maryland, in fact, has another connection to this story, which I'm sure we'll get into later, maybe. But so it's 1779. The Brits are in New York.
So the British forces in the northern colonies are primarily in New York. They also have Nova Scotia, and particularly the port of Halifax. And one of their primary communication routes runs from Halifax and Nova Scotia down to New York. So there's a number of problems that come with this, because American privateers have made this a dangerous passage. Plus now the French are in the war. So this makes naval communications perhaps a little bit more dicey than they used to be. So in addition to concerns of a second Arnold expedition or a second Nova Scotia expedition, they're also looking towards the sea, and they are looking for a naval port that they can put together and use relatively quickly. So sheltered ports along the New England coast are pretty rare. Most of them are either open to the sea, are very dangerous to use during parts of the year, or lack shelter. But one of the exceptions is what will later become known as Castine. So Castine as a town name does not exist yet. That comes out of a town meeting in 1796, and nobody's quite sure why.
Okay. So what's the area known as?
So this is known as either Penobscot, Bagaduce, or Maja Bagaduce, and about 8 different spellings of all of those.
All right.
So it's a very well protected port. It's a deep water anchorage, and it's far enough away from American population centers that it's not going to provoke quite the local resistance that perhaps a port like a Portland or something like that would. So this is ideal. And there's a British force that gathers in Halifax in the summer of 1779 to seize this point of land. So it's a relatively defensible place. If you're familiar with New England geography, you've heard of the neck on a lot of things. So the small village of Bagaduce is on basically a peninsula with a very narrow neck that opens up to the rest of Maine on land. It's a deep water harbor. It's right on the Penobscot River, which has relatively easy communications by water all the way up to Canada. It's roughly halfway between New York and Halifax. In short, it's the ideal place for a new base for the British. So part of this is defensive, but part of it is offensive. Because since the war has moved down to New York and points south, well, this potentially is a place where, maybe small naval units or small forces could go up and down the New England coast harassing the settlements there. So hopefully drawing troops away from the American army, drawing supplies, and just being a general nuisance. So Brigadier General Francis McLean, he's a Scotsman, has most of a Scots regiment under his command, shows up, and the town surrenders. It's undefended, unfortified, out on its own. The British Navy, British Army shows up. There really is no resistance.
Just take it.
Well, it'll happen again. It comes back again in 1814.
All right.
And so there's actually a second Penobscot expedition. That's even less famous than the 1779 one, if that's possible.
Without betraying anything in the story, does it go the same way this one's about to go?
Yes, except for the defense fires one shot. In
wow.
1814.
Extreme differences.
Progress there.
Yeah.
From the American side.
All right, no more spoilers. No more spoilers. Otherwise, there'll be no reason to listen to the episode. So, all right. So what is it? Magadoos? Did I say that? Bagadoos?
Yeah, Bagadoos is what you usually see.
This area, I guess that's the locals basically fold as soon as the British Army and Navy show up. Are they establishing rigid structures, or are they basically building like a semi-permanent bivouac camp situation?
Yes, they are fully fortifying the place. So they start development of what later becomes called Fort George, which is a pretty classical, 18th century frontier fortification.
Pretty typical name too.
Yeah.
There's a lot of Fort Georges out there.
So it's what we would just look at as a regular European style fort. It was designed to hold about 500 men at full capacity. So it had, 4 bastions. So the little triangular bastions that you see on the corners of forts in the area. So they have that. Earthworks, the ditch out in front, a wooden wall on top. That's the plan, at least. And that is after the American expedition, what comes into being. At the time of the expedition itself, most of that is not completed. The walls are about 2 feet tall on 2 sides of the fort, and the rest is completely unbuilt because they're building this completely from scratch. So they're still living in tents. So things like houses and barracks and stuff like that would be a little bit later on before winter. And they're setting up, in theory, a permanent base. Because there's another element to the story that's pretty interesting. And that was, in theory, this was going to be the new boundary between the British holdings in Nova Scotia and what would be America. So it's not a new idea. This had been kicking around back and forth between the British and the French, and the Penobscot had been a de facto boundary going back for a century by this point. But the idea was that this would be a permanent base, and it would start a new colony called New Ireland, which would be everything from the Penobscot north and east to Nova Scotia.
So the British are already sort of preparing that they're not going to maintain control of the American colonies, and so they're thinking ahead to like new demarcation lines. Is that what I'm understanding here?
It was pretty clear in London at this time that at least the New England colonies were lost.
Oh, wow.
So Connecticut and up, they were pretty well reconciled to the fact that in some form they were going to be out of the empire.
Which makes sense when you consider the dramatic shift in focus to the South Carolina theater, where things sort of like get pushed up into Yorktown and then kind of wrap up from there.
The Southern theater as a whole, yeah.
Yeah, they're probably focusing. Maybe that's the play they think they can keep. Wow, I never really thought about that before. So they're looking to establish like sort of the future of the English holdings in North America right there on that line with whatever America is to become. That's wild.
Right. And New England economically is the least useful of the colonies.
Sure.
In terms of, it's fish and lumber and things like that the British can get from Nova Scotia, from Canada, or from other places.
Literally anywhere.
Pretty much New England has been written off in London. So we have that. This is going to be the new boundary, a new colony established there that was going to put in that national boundary and also important to establish a refuge for loyalist refugees. So
that was going to be my question, if that's what it would be used for, considering the amount of folks that are fleeing New England and other parts of the colonies. That's very interesting.
Right, because even using John Adams' numbers, a third of the people were loyalist, a third supported the revolution, and a third were neutral. And that's probably overstating the case. So there are tens of thousands of people fleeing this new American experiment. Where are they going to go? And that's something that British authorities in London are very conscious of, is that these people who have shown that type of loyalty to the crown need to be taken care of somehow. So they look to Maine as part of the solution. So the British forces show up, they start to fortify the position. Word of this filters back down to Boston. And this is part of the state of Massachusetts. They see potential for serious trouble for New England, for the coastal communities, for fishing, for shipping, and they decide they're going to do something about it. So they get together with the Continental Navy, the State Navy, and this will be a problem a little bit later on, various privateers or privately owned war vessels, and they're going to send an expedition up to take care of this force. So they gather together, turns into a total of 39 ships, and they start to recruit troops as they're coming up the coast. So this American army that's coming up the coast is literally being recruited from farmers and fishermen as the expedition is coming up the coast. So they arrive in Penobscot Bay. By that time, they have somewhere between 1,000 and 1,200 men. So they outnumber the British somewhere between, 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1.
Is there a comparison in the numbers, like how many they left with versus how many they picked up in recruitment along the way?
It's scattered all over.
Okay.
This expedition was put together in the span of a couple of weeks, which is incredibly fast for a government of any time. But for the 18th century government to put together a substantive military expedition in 2 weeks is nothing short of incredible.
Yeah.
Now, in some of our pre-work for this show, there was a lot of comments about the quality of these troops that are being picked up. And you kind of implied it there a little bit in the fact that they're building this expedition as they're moving up the coast. But these really aren't the proper militia and whatnot. This is more citizenry.
These are green fellas.
Well, they were militia. In terms of under the law, all males between the ages of 16 and 45 were members of the militia. So this is one of those where, some of them would have been very green, people who had been, farming or fishing, days before. Some of them perhaps would have had some military experience or may have had experience earlier in the war. So that's certainly possible. But as a collective, it is a pretty green group. They have not worked together. They have not trained together. They have not served together. So it's large, but command and control is going to be a problem because they're not regular soldiers.
They're going to have to learn today.
Well, they're also going to be dealing with an extremely difficult organization structure with naval and army elements. And how do they work together?
Right.
But it gets even worse.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah. If it was just Army, Navy, that would be hard enough, but functional. Over on the Navy side, it is the fleet in terms of it's a number of ships heading from one place to another, but it's not a fleet like we think of it where there's clear command or control there either. The naval commander officially is a guy by the name of Saltonstall, who is from the Continental Navy, but there are Continental ships, there are state of Massachusetts ships, but the bulk of the fleet were privateers. So ships that were put together and owned and operated by people who were at least loosely connected with this military structure, but who really were independent owners and operators of their vessels. So I'm not sure what the naval version of mob is, but whatever that word is, that's it.
All right.
So
very ragtag fleet.
It's pretty much everything that could be scraped up in 2 weeks.
Wow.
And that will lend itself to any number of problems. So this force shows up in Penobscot Bay, and the British look at this fleet because numerically it's a huge fleet. They know they're outnumbered, but by the standards of the day, they had to put up a resistance.
Right.
They could not surrender with honor without at least fighting. And they have some advantages, because Bagaduce is a tough terrain to fight on if you're coming in from the water, if you cannot use the harbor. It's pretty tall and rocky cliffs on two sides, although the open part opening up into the harbor, that's pretty usable. But inside the harbor, there are 3 vessels of the Royal Navy, and they are under the command of a guy by the name of Mowat, who is infamous along the coast because he's the guy that torches Falmouth back in 1775. So he has a history here. He's not going to give in.
Okay.
Francis McLean, to preserve his honor and to make a fight, he's not going to give in, at least right away. So this lends itself directly to a military solution. So there's two competing ideas here. Now, the Navy wants the Army to land, take over the shore zone, take out the British batteries. The Navy will sit outside the harbor and wait there. The Army looks at the Navy and says, well, we really can't do anything on shore until you go into the harbor and get those British ships out of there. Okay, so let's compromise. Let's both go at once. Which, okay, that'll work. So Saltonstall takes his frigate, the 32-gun ship Warren, into Castine Harbor. The good news is the harbor is deep. The bad news is that the harbor is narrow. So trying to maneuver a large sailing ship into the harbor or out of the harbor is a very complex task. And sailing ships are the most complex machinery of the entire age. So with all the ropes and the mast and the spars, and it's a very complex machine to run. So any bit of damage could be critical. So as he's going into the harbor, he ends up with a cannonball in the foremast. So the foremast is the forwardmost mast of the ship. If that collapses, well, his steering's gone. Propulsion is going to be severely impacted. Chances are he's going to run aground and end up losing the whole ship. So in a pretty good feat of seamanship, he's able to pull out of the harbor and make repairs. The mast stays up. That's the good news. But that impresses on him that there's no way he's taking the fleet into Castine Harbor again. Ashore, things are going a little bit better. So at a place called Dice Head, which is sort of the cliffs on the riverside of this peninsula, there is a force of militia and U.S. Continental Marines that storm up these cliffs, and they are very successful. They eventually beat in the British defense. They had a picket line up there. The British commanding general from the Peninsular War, a guy by the name of John Moore, is actually commanding officer there. And they have celebration dinners in his honor in Castine all the way through the 1960s.
Oh, wow.
So sort of a strange little tangent. So the Marines, the militia, storm up the cliffs, and that part of the peninsula is very heavily wooded. So remember, these are amateur troops. They've just stormed up the cliffs. They've beaten back the British. They're going through the woods, and things just start to fall apart. They get lost in the woods. Command and control falls apart. They reach a certain point that they just need to stop and reorganize. Meanwhile, in the fort, McLean, according to legend, is standing next to the flagpole with a knife in his hand to cut down the flag. He's made the defense that honor has required. He can surrender with his conscience clear.
Now, how many troops does McLean actually have under his command? We've got 3 Royal Navy vessels in the harbor, but the ground forces, approximately?
About 600 to 700.
Okay, so a decent chunk of troops.
Yeah, he's doing okay. He's outnumbered, but it's not too small to be functional.
Right.
So he's, according to legend, ready to surrender, but the American troops stop. The command and control has fallen apart. You have guys running around in the woods trying to figure out which direction they're going. So things just start to fall apart. They need to stop and reorganize. Well, this gives McLean time to stop and reorganize too. So we have a standoff. And what had been, in theory, a quick expedition to snap up a small enemy garrison starts to turn into a regular siege. The American troops start to dig lines in the woods. The British continue to dig their fortifications. The British ships are still in the harbor. The American fleet is still in Penobscot Bay. So we have a stalemate. Well, how do you break a stalemate? Right across from Bagaduce town was an island called Nautilus Island. So this is the ocean side of the harbor. It was a small island unoccupied by the British. And the Americans decide, if we put our artillery guns here, we'll be able to force the British fleet back. We'll be able to cover that more easy sloping ground near the village itself. This is going to be a major advantage to us. So they send out Paul Revere.
Oh yeah, Paul Revere. This is the part Parker. This is the part Parker loves talking about. So let's go, Paul Revere time. Sorry, I get very excited.
So Paul Revere, he's the lieutenant colonel of the Massachusetts Artillery. So he has really no qualifications to command artillery, other than he is a well-known patriot. And he's firmly loyal, and that entire Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and all of that.
Yeah,
we'll come back to that later because that has its own problems.
Yes,
indeed.
But he's reliable. So they take over Nautilus Island. It wasn't defended, so that was the one thing. But they run into a problem. The guns are too small.
So they can't reach. Is that what you're saying?
Yep, they cannot reach the fort.
Got it.
And with the weaponry of the time, you could only elevate a cannon's barrel so much.
Right.
So the trajectory is all wrong. They only have 6-pounders. So a 6-pound iron ball, which, it sounds like a lot, but in terms of artillery, it's not considered to be a big weapon. So they're implanted there. The British fleet does have to move back up into the harbor a little bit more, but the guns are there without real purpose. They cannot hit the Royal Navy ships now that they've moved. They cannot hit the start of Fort George. They cannot hit the British positions down near the village. They're basically there, and they're not very particularly functional. There's more problems. Revere is the commander of this artillery battery, but for whatever reason, he doesn't want to sleep on shore. So every night he goes out to one of the ships in the harbor, has dinner, sleeps out there, and in the morning comes back.
Oh.
So
why? Just begs the question, why?
Well, part of it is comfort, because if you've been on the Maine coast in June and July, black fly season and mosquito season's a real thing.
Do you think he's trying to avoid being captured?
Well, there's nobody on the island to capture him.
I just, for the Paul Revere defender out there, who's like, maybe he doesn't want to be captured. Like, just, want to sink that one. It's such a weird, I love the weirdness inherent in humanity, and we try to connect to human things all the time. And all I'm hearing is that Paul Revere's just being weird and maybe doesn't want to sleep with some bugs. So I'm going to go get on this ship and make it super, super hard to do anything.
Well, in his defense, he's not a professional military figure. He's not an artilleryman. He's politically reliable, and that's his qualification. So he's been put in a spot that he's really not qualified to be in. So I think that's
all right.
Fair.
Sure.
That's fair. Yeah.
Does he know he's not qualified to be in it? Some commanders will study later in the military timelines. Ambrose Burnside. But is Paul Revere sort of self-aware of I am in command of an artillery unit?
I'm in over my head.
Yeah.
Doesn't seem like it.
Oh, good.
Confidence is everything.
Yeah. Well, fake it until you make it.
Yes.
One of your favorite phrases.
That's one of my favorite. And I hope Paul Revere was saying that during the revolution. He's like, I don't know what we're doing, fellas, but fake it till we make it. Fire. He's like, I just told you the guns won't reach. He's like, fake it till you make it, baby. And he just keeps launching cannonballs.
Yeah, well, keep shooting. You'll hit something eventually.
Yeah, the water.
Put up the impression. Yeah.
All right.
So you have that in place, which doesn't change the calculations here at all on the British troops being relatively well protected, the American troops trying to find a way to capture this point. So I'm sure everybody's been stuck in committee meetings before. In some capacity or another.
Wah, wah.
And it just turns into this sort of circular firing squad of everybody goes around the circle and says something, and then we go back around again, and the whole thing like that. So this is happening squared with the American forces, because out at sea, Saltonstall has a very loose command, and I use that word command very lightly, of the Navy. They're not willing to go into the harbor again, even with Revere's guns in place. No interest. On the Army side, they're having some of the same problems. As the commander of this expedition, a guy by the name of Solomon Lovell, He's been well connected with the militia movement. He's a little bit of an older gentleman, and he's not getting along very well with his second in command, a guy by the name of Wadsworth. Wadsworth is a much more adventurous, energetic officer who wants to do much more for the army to try to break this deadlock. He's generally overruled, and the siege just continues. So they start to set up different artillery batteries on shore, so across what's now called Hatch Cove, which is on the mainland side of the Bagaduce Peninsula. So this is going to set in to a European style of siege. So by the rules of the day, forts were not supposed to hold out indefinitely.
Right.
The usual rule of thumb was that a fort could hold out for 6 weeks before a lack of food or other supplies would require them to surrender. So the Americans think that time is on their side. Well, McLean had sent word up to Halifax and down to New York that he has a problem here, that he's being besieged by superior numbers, mass numbers of ships, and he needs help now. The government in Halifax is sympathetic, but they have nothing to send. The entire provincial government has 1 sloop, and if they completely stripped the garrison of Halifax bare, they could scrape up a couple of hundred men, which would leave Halifax completely vulnerable, which is not something they want to do. It had the only royal dockyard north of New York in the entire American theater, so they have no interest in doing that. There's also some questions in the government about the loyalty of a lot of the settlers in Nova Scotia. Much of the population of Nova Scotia consisted of people who had immigrated from New England during the 1760s. So there's a fear that maybe if the army departs, well, there might be some uprisings in Nova Scotia. That doesn't happen, but that's a fear. So the Nova Scotia pretty much sends word down that, sorry, we can't help. Word gets down to New York, and there's an enterprising Navy admiral by the name of Sir George Collier in command of the fleet there. And he's a very energetic officer. And he says, this is a perfect situation because not only do we have a chance to get one of the Continental Navy's frigates, and there's not very many of those around, we also have a collection of dozens of privateers. Now, the British fleet had been chasing privateers all over the northern Atlantic for years, and here they are all nice and parked in one spot where we know where to find them.
Yeah, get them in one go.
Yeah. So he goes, okay, this works. So he scrounges up some troops as reinforcements, and he puts to sea in a 64-gun ship of the line. Now, the ship of the line is pretty much the battleship of the day. When it arrives in Penobscot Bay, it has the heaviest artillery of anybody there, Army or Navy, most heavily armored. It is pretty much, in control of all of its, all of that it surveys. The only problem being that if it gets too close to shore because it draws a lot of water, well, that could be a problem. So it's very powerful, but there's that little weakness.
Plus, if she gets into a fight close to shore, this is one of my 64 guns. You said is what this ship is rocking right now.
It's a big girl, yeah.
So,
yes.
Not a full 100 years, but we're talking maybe like 80 years or so before Edward Teach, famous pirate Blackbeard, has like at one point like a 40 or 48 gun ship. And I think that's part of his doing in is he's too close to the shore. He unleashes a broadside and it beaches the ship from the force of the guns going off. I can't. And I think in that situation, like 40 guns going off, like that must sound like hell opening up on Earth.
Yeah.
Let's add 24 more guns to that and make it 64. So when this ship opens up ever, like with a full broadside, it's got to be like tearing a hole in the earth.
Yeah, it's if you go on YouTube, the HMS Victory, which is in dry dock over in England.
I've seen that video.
They're just firing off cannon shots, just one after the other, and it is almost deafening on screen. So just a really interesting video to give you an idea of what the sound of that would be. So he has that, a number of frigates, so 32 gunships and 20 some odd gunships, and he's going to come to McLean's rescue. Well, word of this reaches the American lines. So they figure out that it's either now or never. So the very day the British fleet shows up, The American Navy finally came up with a plan to enter into the harbor. The American Army finally reached a mutually agreeable plan to attack the British troops. And just before all that was going to go off, their lookouts sight Collier's fleet coming into the bay. Well, now what? So you can either keep on with the attack and more or less just switch places to have the British fleet out in the harbor, the American fleet in the bay, and the British troops as prisoners, but take over their positions. Well, okay, if that sounds like a complete mess, it would have been. The other thing to do is just to run. The American Navy, they take a look at the fleet coming into the harbor. There's no way they can withstand that. Given absolute perfect circumstances, given time to prepare, perhaps something could have been put together, but they just don't have the time. So the American fleet, particularly those privateers that are sort of loosely under command anyway, they just start to run. And they start to run up the Penobscot River with the hope being that if they go up far enough, they'll get beyond the reach of the British Navy. Some try to sneak out the other side of the bay, which really doesn't work either. By the end of the day, the entire fleet is either burned or captured. And they're finding parts of the Penobscot Expedition as far north as Bangor.
Really? Wow.
When they put in the Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain Bridge in the 60s, they were pulling out artillery from the 1779 expedition out of the river bottom. So if you're in Bangor or in Brewer, you'll see cannon from this expedition along the river walkway.
Brewer is our producer's hometown. He is very fond of this this artillery you speak of.
Oh, okay. So he knows exactly what I'm talking about. He knows the gun I'm speaking of.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the Navy is off the picture. Now, what happens with the Army is a little bit more in dispute because you remember that Revere guy. He has the artillery. The idea and what Lovell tells him to do is to get the guns off of Nautilus Island, get them up to what is now present-day Bucksport. So the present-day site of Fort Knox, which is built later in the 1830s and 40s. If you set up guns there, the river starts to narrow significantly, and it'll at least be defensible to where the American Army can regroup, the Navy can regroup, and they can come up with another plan. Now, this is the dispute, and there's an entire book on this called The Court-Martial Paul Revere. And who did it? Greenberg, I think, is the guy that wrote it. Either he was unable to do that, which in the mass chaos of an expedition falling apart, that's plausible, or he's unwilling to do that, which there's that argument that's made as well.
Well, that makes a very different picture, though. Like if he can't versus he won't.
Yeah, and this will become a political football a little bit later on because there has to be accountability for something blowing up this spectacularly.
So we've got privateers that are just fleeing to the wind. What organization the Continental Navy is trying to maintain is running up the river. A bunch of the privateers are going with them. The Army's now the Army's ride essentially has gone. And so now it's trying to figure out what to do.
I didn't even think about it in that context. The Army's like, crap, that's how we get home. And these guys aren't just leaving. Some of them are scuttling their own ships just so the Brits can't get them. So like there's no way home.
Yeah, that's pretty much what happens. Their ride pretty much leaves them standing there on the curb. And they're in a really tough shape. So what they do is that they just start to literally walk home.
Is this the source of the beef between the Marines and the Navy, you think? The Marines got left on shore and the Marines are forever bitter about it still?
No, in the British Navy, that one goes even further back.
All right.
As the Marines originally were soldiers that would be serving on ships.
Right.
And there's been just a centuries-long conflict between soldiers serving on the ships and the sailors that sail the ships. So this one predates the Revolution by a long time.
All right. Well,
it doesn't help.
Sure,
we can say that.
Well, if you're a Marine out there and you want to tell us your story about being stranded on shore by the Navy, we would love to hear it. Reach out to historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Any Marines globally, any Marine Corps, if you've been left on shore, let us know.
Oh, next podcast on Guadalcanal then.
There you
Yes.
go. Exactly.
Oh, man.
So the Army is pretty much walking home, literally.
Wow.
So they start to go up the river. Eventually they cross the Penobscot, and they do literally end up walking home because the Navy's been destroyed. So that's the end of the military portion of the Penobscot Expedition. Bagaduce remains in British hands until 1784. And it was only because of John Adams that the part of the Maine coast from the Penobscot to the St. Croix is returned to the United States. That particular boundary dispute goes on until the 1840s. When they put the boundary, they said the boundary would follow the headwaters of the St. Croix River. The problem was nobody knew where that was.
Oh, that's interesting.
So there's a wonderful 1802 map that cuts Maine off right in the middle and just has an arrow that points up and says, there are many mountains and rivers in this section of undetermined location.
Wow.
So they're still sorting out the map as late as the 1840s.
So 20 years into their statehood, the border isn't officially established up there.
Nope, it's not till 1842 that the New Brunswick border is officially established.
I just feel like that's sort of like something you should do at the, beginning of your statehood. Like at least know what your borders are.
Well, it was a federal problem.
Right,
I see,
exactly.
I see. Because that's how states like Texas are like, that's mine and that's mine. And everything used to be Texas.
It's also true.
All right. So the military engagement, that is the Penobscot Expedition, has come to a close. Right. So we had, what looked like to be a quick shock and awe kind of strike, joint military operation where they were going to overrun this fort and sort of break off this attempt at establishing a stronghold, a foothold, in the back door of the American nation that's being formed right now. And all it took to sort of scare this attack off was some muscle flexing. The Brits they do enough of a stand, I guess you could say, that some resupply gets there. That big ship comes in with 64 guns. The Americans go, oh, they say the S word really loud and they run away. I feel like it was like a Monty Python scene where they're like, run away. But they just sort of bolt out of there. The Army, quite literally, and some of the Marine elements are walking home. Now, when you say walk home, these are, like you said, local. So they're not walking like down to lower Massachusetts. These are guys who are walking to various other parts of the main region of the Massachusetts colony. But are
they dragging their guns with them too, Patrick?
Nope. The guns get left behind.
Wow. Okay. That's a loss.
Well, there's no roads up in that part of Maine at that time.
Exactly going to ask that. Yep.
Right. If there's no ships to transport them, yeah, that stinks.
Yeah, and those things, there's small artillery pieces in the military sense, but those things are heavy.
Yeah.
And no roads or anything else like that. So that's the end of the military expedition. Then we get to the fight. And this is in some ways, the even more interesting part is who gets blamed for all of this.
All right.
Because
somebody's got to get blamed.
A whole lot of finger pointing going on here.
I like the way you said that. Now that we're done with the military part, now we get to the fight.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
And this one gets ugly because Saltonstall, who was the Navy commander, actually gets cashiered. He's forced to resign from the Navy on charges of cowardice.
Wow.
Which is not really a defensible case, I don't think, but I'm not sure I'd want to be his lawyer.
True.
Part of the reason why the finger gets pointed at him is because part of the guarantee that the state of Massachusetts made was that they insured all of the privateers that were sent out on the expedition. So some 30 odd vessels. When they're all lost, that is a huge bill. The state of Massachusetts is almost bankrupted from this expedition.
Matt and I found that particularly interesting. Just the fact that
just fascinating
that they were even willing to do it. And then simultaneously, I kind of threw it to Matt. I was like, but I mean, how would you convince guys to put up their ships unless you were going to guarantee them some compensation if things, go south, and all that. So it just was wild to me that with the amount of ships involved and the amount of them that were private vessels, that they insured.
They were just that confident in this expedition that they could put up the insurance behind all of these vessels.
Well, they thought it would work.
Yeah.
In part, they did not think that there would be that type of strong British reaction. In part, I think they were desperate because this expedition gets put together in a couple of weeks. So maybe they would make some deals under that time compression that they otherwise would not have made.
It's a fine point.
Leadership is sitting there going, we rushed this. I don't see how this went so poorly. I just don't understand.
Well, it's Saltonstall's fault, according to the Army.
Right.
Because here's the hook. The idea in Massachusetts was that if Saltonstall is to blame, then they can take those insurance bills and the cost of the expedition and make that part of Congress's bill.
Oh.
So if it was a collapse due to a continental failure, that turns into a continental bill.
Ooh.
So that's part of the urge to nail him. Lovell and Wadsworth point the finger pretty strongly at Paul Revere, not only for his inefficiency during the battle with the artillery, but also what they deemed to be his failure in not securing the guns and bringing the guns and setting up a defense further up the Penobscot River. So in 1781, he was going to be court-martialed. Governor of the state at the time was Thomas Hancock, who had absolutely no interest in a court-martial of Paul Revere. 1781, the revolution is going very well. This is just sort of that, backwards infighting that there's just no interest in. So that does not end up happening. Wadsworth points the finger at Lovell because he was not as energetic as he thought that he should have been. So as this starts to fall apart, fingers are pointing all over the place as they try to figure out what went wrong.
Classic government.
So Revere retires in pretty much disgrace. But, and here's the irony part, we're all familiar with his story from Midnight Ride of Paul Revere and all of that.
Sure.
That was actually a work of historical rehab in 1860. And it was the grandson of Wadsworth, the general. It was his grandson that actually writes the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere.
Why?
Well, 1860, it's the lead up to the Civil War.
True.
Right.
And a lot of the American heroes from the American Revolution were Southerners. So figures like a Washington or a Jefferson, well, they're both Virginians. So there's a need for a Northern hero of the American Revolution. So Longfellow put out this long poem about Paul Revere, and pretty much what happened up at Penobscot got swept under the rug.
Is Paul Revere at the time of the Penobscot Expedition and his, subsequent court-martial that didn't court-martial him, is he enjoying fame? Like we know him now, he has all this sort of retrospective fame. Like Paul Revere is a revered American, pun intended. But at the time, is Paul Revere sort of amongst the ranks of the men fighting, known for these exploits of having done the ride and being a part of the original, what was it, the Sons of Liberty and all that stuff?
Not really. He was well known in Boston because he was part of that community, and Boston was a much smaller place then. But he was not really well known outside of those circles. Certainly he was known as a supporter of the Patriot cause, but he was not really, of a rank of a Jefferson or a Washington or a John Adams, sort of that, front rank of American heroes or of revolutionary heroes that were revered at the time.
So when Thomas Hancock, by the way, before I continue, is Thomas Hancock related to John Hancock?
John Hancock. Yeah, I was thinking Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. We invented a new founding father, everyone. That's what the History Things podcast says.
Yeah. No, John Hancock.
John Hancock. All right, so that's what I was going to ask is if he was related. So John Hancock obviously is not going to court-martial his buddy from the Boston days of revolution early in the war. So that makes perfect sense.
Right.
Plus, everybody's probably like you said, hyper aware of hey, everybody needs to appear in one direction right here. Like, appearances kind of mean a lot right now. And if we're infighting, that's a bad look. So when you say he sort of retires in disgrace, does he retire in disgrace locally and nationally? He's still a relatively obscure figure because he didn't write any crazy legislation. He just kind of had this really badass horse ride and then lost a bunch of guns.
Well, and that's the thing, is that he didn't even actually make the full ride.
Right, exactly.
He got arrested halfway through, so it wasn't even Paul Revere's ride up until the 1860 poem.
That's right. We got to give William Dawes some due and a whole bunch of others.
A bunch of others, yeah. But yes, definitely Dawes.
So he's in Boston. He's known, but he's not really famous for his revolutionary exploits. Up in Maine, his reputation severely suffers to this day in many quarters. Part of the book on the court-martial of Paul Revere is in part a rehab of his reputation.
Interesting.
Like a rehabbing of his terrible reputation?
Yeah, well, historical rehab, it's a thing.
Oh, yeah. Most certainly it's a thing.
Yeah, no, we know. Dr. Mudd, looking at you. Wait, what?
Yeah, exactly.
So Peleg Wadsworth's grandson writes the poem. Obviously, that's a cool connection to the Civil War, which, we talk about a lot, that George Washington especially was a figure that both sides of the American Civil War tried to claim symbolically, which you could see problematic in that he's a Virginian and very proud of being a Virginian. So I didn't really realize that the poem had the connections to like inspire some of the patriotism of the founding fathers in the North. So that's a cool connection. See,
it's the mystic chords of memory that Lincoln talks about, reaching back to the heroes of the Revolution. That makes a lot of sense.
I love rabbit holes because they just connect. We just jumped like 80 years ahead into the Civil War with a pretty cool connection to that. So Parker has ancestral ties to the Wadsworth line. So that's one of the things that Parker brings up a lot. So I always blame him for Paul Revere not really being, portrayed accurately. Because if you watch the Sons of Liberty thing, the History Channel did, Paul Revere, like Sam Adams, were like ninja warriors.
Ridiculous.
These guys were like G.I. Joes before G.I. Joes were ever a thing. So there's even in our modern time, there's these concepts that Paul Revere was just nothing other than stunning.
But it sounds like that's not the case up where you're at, Patrick.
Yeah, he's a complex character in a lot of ways. I have some sympathy for him just because he was in a spot that he was not trained to be in.
Sure.
And, why didn't it work? Well, when you're building an army from scratch and a fleet from scratch, literally sailing towards a battle, these are the types of things that are going to happen.
And it was such a close run thing. You said that they were basically on the verge of surrendering when it all disintegrates.
When Paul Revere is accused of not, bringing up his guns, I just want to, for my own brain's sake, is that he's being accused of not bringing up his guns in a timely manner while they were still trying to attack? Or is he being accused of like not trying to pull his guns out of there after the escape ships are all burned and being beached? Because that's kind of silly.
Well, there's a little bit of a time lag between when the British fleet can be seen and when they're actually in the bay. So you have a couple of hours to work with there. And the complaint is that if they could have pulled his guns off at Nautilus Island, got them a little bit upstream to where the Penobscot narrows, the American army would have been able to hold on, and the American fleet would have been able to hold on in a much more, orderly way, and at least had the time to come up with some sort of a plan.
So they're giving him crap for failing to miss an opportunity. Or I'm sorry, no, not for failing, for successfully missing an opportunity. He failed to recognize that moving his guns would work. Was he being advised to do this and just not doing it?
It's unclear. This is a very chaotic situation, and who ran into who and said what is not well recorded. The end result is well known. The guns stay on Nautilus Island, and everybody runs for it. was that really, if you look at it objectively, was that really asking for too much under the circumstances? Probably.
Yeah.
If it takes a day to get them in place, expecting them to get them out of place in an hour or two is probably asking for quite a lot.
And how effective would those 6-pounders have been against a ship of the line?
How does this expedition play into the overall story of the American Revolution? Is this just something that happens in the background? Or when this happens, because I guess we were talking at a time when, the story began, not a lot of action was happening during the war. Is this something that is like put on the spotlight as far as at least like Congress is like well aware of this? This is a big deal in Congress. Is this in the papers?
There's mention that it happened, but it's not anything that the Continental Congress certainly wants to do anything about. Washington wants no part of this. The one group of people that at least had a passing interest in this was actually the French. As in 1780, they send a frigate called the Hermione up into Penobscot Bay and take a look around, see what's happening with the construction of Fort George and all that. They fire one shot to let the British know they were there, and then they move on.
That was a symbolic middle finger that the French give to the British pretty regularly.
Sounds like
pretty much. That was the one time that there was an effort to sort of look in and see what was going on. But this far down the coast of what becomes Maine, really it's out of sight and out of mind. New England really does not have the resources in and of themselves to mount a second expedition. Continental Congress has more than they can handle with New York and then the Southern campaign starting up. So really it's one of those things that is just let to set and rest until it was time to come up with the final peace treaty and the debates over where the boundary line would be. And it was relatively easy for the British to give up. The efforts to establish New Ireland was not successful. They had about 300 to 400 settlers actually show up. So that's not a big thing. For the British government, what's going on the down east Maine coast is just not a big deal, because they have concerns over with Gibraltar in Europe. They have concerns in the West Indies. They have concerns all over the global map, all the way to India. What's happening here is really on, whatever's behind the back burner. That's where this is.
Yeah, much bigger fish to fry.
That is a point that I think many Americans fail to recognize when we talk about, and maybe with good reason, but when we talk about our revolution, like for us, it was everything.
Sure.
We were attempting to establish us. For the British, it was just like another thing that was happening in their massive enterprise that becomes the sun never sets on the British Empire. And like, I think people are very disconnected from that fact. Like, I think the number, like somewhere like around 30% or even less sticks out of my mind, but like, that's all the British contribute militarily to suppressing our rebellion. Like, they don't even commit the full force of their navy or their militaries. Like, I basically say, if Britain really wanted to keep the colonies, they could have. This is what they gave us to basically earn it.
Well, and at what cost?
Sure.
Right.
To borrow a term from a much later war, what we see in Vietnam as we get into the 1970s, that Vietnamization process, we see something a little bit similar with the British war effort in 1780s, because they're depending more and more on loyalist troops, as their regulars are needed in Ireland. They're needed at home. They're needed at Gibraltar. Now they're needed in the West Indies. They're needed all over the place. So by the time we get to 1781, there's more Americans or people born in the colonies who are serving in the British Army than there is in the American Army.
Yeah, that's a great point. That is a great point.
So, I mean, I think the point of, the American War is one feature of many is important. What's happening this far away, down here, down east, is, it is out of sight, out of mind, and there's nothing that could be done about it.
So 1783, the Treaty of Paris signed, the revolution is over, America's established. 1784, you said it was when when they give up. So they hang out in the region. I guess it's a quiet Is it like a Cold War sort of like tensions are high, or is it just sort of like, well, the British are there?
Yeah, we don't see a lot of local resistance. The idea was that they were going to treat what few settlers there were right around Bagaduce very gently, because they're trying to establish a new colony.
Right.
So it's military rule in the sense of there is a military governor, but it's not that really strict martial type of law that we normally think of as military rule. So,
which betrays how the British rule in Ireland at the time. So, that's such a bad joke, but I'm Irish by descent, so I feel the need to just take that dig. Somebody during the pandemic shared a meme with me that was like, I guess the British Red Cross was requesting blood donations from the Irish, and somebody said, "Don't you have enough Irish blood already?"
Ouch.
So, 1798 is another conversation.
Right, yeah, exactly. So let's have another short conversation before we wrap things up here. You mentioned at the beginning of this show that there was a second expedition that takes place during the War of 1812 theater.
I had no idea.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. Is there like a condensed version of that, or do you want to tell like a crazy long version? Like, I'm super interested in the fact that there's a part 2, a 2.0 to this. Obviously Paul Revere's not involved in that one, but do the Brits come back and occupy old fortifications or build new ones? Like, what's the story with the second expedition?
Yes, the part 2 to this is the War of 1812. So the War of 1812 is widely unpopular in New England. They want no part of it. Most folks along the coast of Maine want no part of it. British authorities in Canada and in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, they want no part of it. So that joke from the 60s song about if they throw a war and nobody comes, what happens? Well, we find out.
Okay.
War of 1812 along the Maine border and along the Maine coast was effectively canceled. The British authorities put out a notice that says, if you don't start a fight, we won't either. That was it until war starts in June of 1812. Up until the summer of 1814, that's pretty much how things were governed. The British did not have the forces to do anything. Really, they were understaffed through the entire war all over. Most of their troops are off in New York or Ontario, out that way.
We're fighting Napoleon.
Well, the Peninsular War is still up and running.
Right, exactly.
So, yeah, that's a thing. By the time we get, and this is where my particular dissertation research comes in, is because we have a thriving trade in flour. Being smuggled from Maine into Nova Scotia with the open connivance of British authorities all over the place. So pretty much Nova Scotia starves if they participate in the war that the empire's already in against the people they're fighting against. And if that sentence makes absolutely no sense, it's because this section of history is basically a Second City TV routine, and you're wondering who's writing the material. By the time we get to mid-1814, this starts to shift. And there's an idea that comes around in September where the British are going to reoccupy what's now called Castine. So the exact same place as Penobscot 1.0, but this time they show up with a fleet and 4,000 men.
They took notes. They were like, we need more guys than last time.
There was an American Navy ship, so U.S. Navy, the brig Adams, that had run aground off the Maine coast that was sheltering in Penobscot Bay. And so you can pick that up along the way. And all of the same sort of factors that went into 1.0 show up again. The difference this time is that there had been a land route between New Brunswick and Quebec across what is now northern Maine. So this was going to be sort of an edge guard against that, to still a curling term. So they're going to guard that road by having Castine. Okay, so there's 40 soldiers defending the place. They fire one shot for the honor of the flag, and they run. The town minister tears his tablecloth off of the table, runs down to a rowboat, goes out and surrenders the town.
Wow.
So the British send a force up the Penobscot. There's a very short battle in Hampden. The Adams is destroyed. And in the surrender treaty, everything from the Penobscot east in Maine was surrendered to the British. So they're setting up camp in Castine again. And this time they're going to do it bigger and better. So Fort George is still there. That's been completed. There's another fort called Fort Madison along the entry to the harbor. And by the time they're done building different forts and blockhouses all over that peninsula, it's the most heavily fortified spot in all of North America.
Really? That's
there
funny.
are gun batteries and forts and everything all over the place, including such strange places as the 9th hole of what is now the Castine Golf Course.
But it's such a nondescript little area. Like, it's so well fortified. Here, we shall make, you shall not pass in Penobscot. Like that.
Well, and it was very profitable for trade. It still has the harbor. Mm-hmm. The customs duties alone for all the stuff that was coming into Castine and then was smuggled across the river into the American side, that was the origins of the Dalhousie University up in Halifax.
Oh,
and
right.
There was so much gold leaving the United States through Castine that there's this wonderful newspaper article that comes out and says that the United States Post Office cuts off delivery to Castine, and so much gold was leaving through the port of Castine that the American economy was about to collapse.
Wow.
So that's Penobscot 2.0. There's another peace treaty that's signed in December of 1814 that returns the boundaries to where they were before the war. So in, I think, either March or April, I forget, I think April of 1815, the British troops leave Castine for the last time.
But how would they know where the borders are? These borders are in dispute until 1840. So they're like, this area, which we drew in crayon because this is not a permanent map, I guess, for another couple decades. So like arbitrarily, there's just lines in the sand. They're like, we're going here officially.
Well, there was some dispute over that too, because the British negotiators for this peace treaty actually were trying to cite a river that did not exist as the boundary line. There was no such river in that location. So the St. Croix along the coast is a pretty well-known spot. The problem was that nobody actually knew where the river came from. So that was the dispute all the way into the 1840s. So it was clear that Castine would have been on the American side of the border unless the boundary was redrawn at the Penobscot, which the British at the end of 1814, they're completely exhausted by decades of war. They're not willing to go to the mat over down East Maine again.
You're like, this is the most annoying itch. It just will not go away. Why do we keep having to think about this? Napoleon's invading and we're dealing with this?
Well, for 1812, there was a lot of feelings of betrayal in Britain over the American declaration of war.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
So they were not very happy, to say the least, with the United States. And then sort of the conduct of the war starts to spiral downhill,
right?
Particularly out in the West. So there is a lot of feelings of betrayal, hostility, and annoyance.
We have a special relationship. We have a special relationship
That's
with
right.
England. It's important that we remember that, everyone out there, seek your British friends and your British, our British and United K listeners. Remember, we're your American friends. Special relationship.
That's right.
Shout out to all of our listeners in the United Kingdom. Thank you guys for your support. We have a randomly huge following over there, and we're super appreciative of it. So thanks for all y'all out there.
Now, Patrick, before we press on here, you've been describing a lot of fortifications that were built not only for the first expedition, but especially for the second expedition. It sounds like there's a golf course on top of some of those, but how much preservation work has been done for these various earthworks and fortifications and the like? I'm just curious from a preservationist point of view.
It's a little hit or miss. The earthworks that have been dug out are pretty well preserved. Fort Madison, which is sort of a smaller earthwork down at the harbor mouth, you can still see the walls, the gun embrasures, the whole bit. Fort George, the earthworks are still there, and one of the bastions is still there.
Oh, nice.
So that was preserved as a community park back in the early 1900s. My running joke is that it's pretty much the only flat spot on the whole peninsula. So they use it for things like soccer and baseball and things like that.
Sure.
So when you walk in and the original gate is still, cut out in the earthworks and all that, you look up and you see a baseball backstop cage on the far side. So just absolutely wonderful juxtaposition. The wooden works have long since rotted out, so that's gone. Some of the different places are, if you know what you're looking at, it makes sense. Mm-hmm. For the gun batteries, for example, you'll see a place that's just randomly leveled off for no particular reason, but that was where the gun batteries were going to be. There's one, and it's on the 1815 map of fortifications. It's on there, but there's one that cannot be proven because it's on a high point of land that's now under the town reservoir. So everything else on the map is there, and they've been able to find it, but they can't find that one because they'd have to take out the town reservoir to go find it.
Yeah, they're not going to do that.
Yeah, that's not happening.
We watched a cool documentary on some of the physical preservation of like arms and armament. I guess when the Navy element was fleeing and scattering and scuttling all their ships, they were dumping things that they felt that the British might be able to seize and use just straight into the water. So we were watching there was a guy who found like some cannons and a whole bunch of cannonballs and like helped kind of lead one of the major preservation efforts of some of the artillery pieces and other ordnance that were found up there, which has some connections to the state that this show is produced from, which is Maryland. So do you know if there's a lot of the physical remains, not just in terms of earth, but maybe more in terms of iron that are still floating around from this expedition?
Well, not floating.
Well, you're right, man. God, man.
Yeah, the iron's not floating.
Yeah. All right, look, guys, everybody's ganging up on me. You misspeak one time, Matt. No, I'm just kidding.
Well, we created a new founding father 20 minutes ago, so
and the Titanic floated, which was made of iron. So it's not unfeasible that iron floats.
Cannons don't float.
You're right. So that's where I erred. We're not talking about the Titanic. We're talking about cannons.
There has been a great deal of marine archaeology. William Rice is probably the expeditions that you're thinking of.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
Because he was attached to UMaine and did a lot of work. So it's out there. Some of the stuff has been recovered. Brewer and Bangor both have cannon from the expedition on the waterfront. And part of that was just because they were trying to build a bridge there, and hey, look what we found.
Right.
So there is some of that stuff. Most of the marine elements were just left in the water because the best preservation for them would be to not disturb them and just allow them to be in the water covered with silt and be preserved there. So I have no doubt that the knowledge of where that is out there somewhere. Mm-hmm. It's one of those, I'm happy to know that it's just out there and it's probably best left undisturbed.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely.
But you do find some things like musket balls or some stuff like that. The Castine right around that area itself has been pretty well picked over. It was turned over for farming and grazing soon after the battle. So there was some settlement. Mostly it's a preserve now, at least that part of the peninsula. But you can still see some evidence on the landscape.
All right. Well, before we wrap this up, you get the final word for the Penobscot Expedition. If our listeners were to take away, a quick point or one small thing from like your perspective, what is something you want our listeners to remember or know or take away about either Paul Revere or the expedition as a whole?
Or what's a good resource for them?
Sure.
Well, a good resource to start is the fort. The Cornwell book is very readable. Wadsworth diaries are actually available online, his entire story.
Wow.
So that is a resource out there. And I think that the main takeaway is that, history not only matters, but history happens in places that are off the beaten track. And that even though most people have not heard of Penobscot, 1.0 or definitely 2.0, that major historical events did happen and that it did matter. And then this is probably my more personal plug as somebody that does cross-border history, but not only look at American history as mattering, but also look at the history around us. So the Canadian history, the Nova Scotia history, the British history, that helps explain what happened, and in some cases what did not happen during these times that we are at least passingly familiar with.
Absolutely. Well, we really, really do appreciate you spending some time with us. Are you speaking anytime in the rest of 2021? I guess with 2022. Dude. It's January. It's like, no, it's February. We got to know what our dates are by now. We're already in the second month of the year. When I say it goes fast, it goes fast. But are you speaking at any point in 2022 where our listeners might be able to catch you if they make their way up to Maine?
Not that I know of, but things like small historical societies and opportunities to speak in places like that tend to come up. Can you stop by and talk in 2 weeks' time on?
You're right.
We're familiar with that.
All right. So make sure everybody just do a broad search. Find all the historical societies in Maine. Follow them so that when Patrick Calloway gets his next gig, you can get out there and support him in person. So thank you for spending some time with us here on the show. Matt, as we turn our attention forward for the season here, we got a few things to sort of check off. So we're wrapping up quarter two. We did talk to David Wood, who was the curator of the Concord Museum. We spent some time talking about the shot heard around the world, the Siege of Boston, and we got ourselves really into the American Revolution. We were excited to continue some of that story today with Mr. Calloway to talk about the Penobscot Expedition, maybe take some stabs at Paul Revere's legacy a little bit, because you know how we do like to poke the bear when it comes to historical myth versus fact, legend, and all that stuff. And we're going to kind of take a short little mid-year respite since, we're kind of getting to the halfway point as spring really bleeds into summer now. So next time you tune into us, you're going to be able to hear Matt and mine's sort of perspective on how the halfway point of season 3 looks for us, what the year's been like, what's coming up, things like that, the mid-year state of things for the History of Things podcast. And then we are going to be heading to a place that Matt and I have looked forward to for a very long time. We did this in season 2. We wrapped up on the Western Front with our good friend John Bracken, where he took us through the war as a whole, specifically the Battle of Verdun with the 151 Regiment. Well, we're going to continue things semi-chronologically. We're going to pick it up in 1916 with the British on the Western Front with the Battle of the Somme. And our good buddy Rob Enfield from British Muzzleloaders is going to be joining us to tell that story. So make sure you tune back in July 1st for that big epic, because we get into that one. We're not getting down into every single unit detail, just as a heads up for you First World War aficionados. We're not getting into every single PALS battalion or whatever, but for those of you who were looking more for the 30,000 foot, this is how the battle and campaign progressed. Put your helmets on. Keep your heads down, because we're on the Western Front, but keep your helmets on. We're gonna have some fun. So, well, we're gonna end the show a little differently today. I'm gonna sign us off, and then our good buddy Parker is gonna take us home with a reading.
That's right.
Of the Midnight Ride of Paul Revere. So just a reminder that you can download this episode and all episodes of the History of Things podcast for free on most major podcast apps. Enjoying the show? Looking for some ways to help us out? We would certainly be very appreciative of that. Make sure you leave us a 5-star rating and a review on your favorite podcast app. Make sure you're telling them that you want to hear the History of Things podcast. As always, make sure you're following us on our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and YouTube. Search for the History of Things podcast. Want to send us an email, get in communication with us, questions, comments, compliments, perhaps a concern, hopefully not. Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. For the History Things podcast, I am your co-host, Pat McGuire. For my co-host, Matt Borders. For our guest, Patrick Calloway. And for our producer, Parker Russell, who was instrumental in making this episode possible. We say thank you very, very much for hanging out with the History Things podcast. And we'll catch you all later.
Have a good night.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere. On the 18th of April in 75, hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. He said to his friend, if the British march by land or sea from the town tonight, hang a lantern aloft in the belfry arch of the old North Church tower as a signal light. One if by land, two if by sea, and I on the opposite shore will be, ready to ride and spread the alarm through every Middlesex village and farm, for the country folk to be up and to arm. Then he said good night, and with a muffled oar, silently rowed to the Charleston shore, just as the moon rose over the bay, where swinging wide at her moorings lay the Somerset, British man of war, a phantom ship with each mast and spar, crossed the moon like a prison bar, and a huge black hulk that was magnified by its own reflection in the tide. Meanwhile, his friend, through alley and street, wanders and watches with eager ears till the silence around him he hears, the muster of men at the barrack door, the sound of arms and the tramp of the feet, the measured tread of the grenadiers marching down to their boats on the shore. Then he climbed the tower of the old North Church by the wooden stairs with stealthy tread to the belfry chamber overhead, and startled the pigeons from their perch on the somber rafters that round him made masses and moving shapes of shade. By the trembling ladder, steep and tall, to the highest window in the wall, where he paused to listen and look down a moment on the roofs of the town, and the moonlight flowing over all. Beneath, in the churchyard, lay the dead in their night encampment on the hill, wrapped in silence so deep and still that he could hear, like a sentinel's tread, the watchful night wind as it went, creeping along from tent to tent, and seeming to whisper, all is well. A moment only he feels the spell of the place, the hour, and the secret dread, lonely belfry and the dead. For suddenly all of his thoughts were bent on a shadowy something far away, where the river widens to meet the bay, a line of black that bends and floats on the rising tide like a bridge of boats. Meanwhile, impatient to mountain ride, booted and spurred with heavy astride, on the opposite shore walked Paul Revere. Now he patted his horse's side and gazed at the landscape far and near. Thus impetuous stamped the earth and turned and tightened his saddle girth. But mostly he watched, with eager search, the belfry tower of the old North Church, as it rose above the graves on the hill, lonely and spectral and somber and still. And lo, as he looks on the belfry's height, a glimmer, and then a gleam of light. He springs to the saddle, the bridle he turns, but he lingers and gazes, till full on his sight a second lamp in the belfry burns. A hurry in the hoofs of the village street, a shape in the moonlight, a bulk in the dark, and beneath from the pebbles a passing spark, struck out by a steed, flying fearless and fleet. That was all, and yet, through the gloom and the light, the fate of the nation was riding that night. And the spark struck out by that steed in his flight kindled the land into flame with its heat. He has left the village and mounted the steed, and beneath him, tranquil and broad and deep, is the mystic meeting the ocean tides, and under the alders that skirt its edge, now soft on the sand, now loud on the ledge, it is heard the tramp of his steed as he rides. It was 12 by the village clock when he crossed the bridge into Medford town. He heard the crowing of the cock and the barking of the farmer's dog, and he felt the damp of the river fog that rises after the sun goes down. It was 1 by the village clock when he galloped into Lexington, when he saw the gilded weathercock swim in the moonlight as he passed, and the meeting-house windows, blank and bare, gaze at him with a spectral glare, as if they already stood aghast at the bloody work they would look upon. It was 2 by the village clock when he came to the bridge in Concord town. He heard the bleating of the flock and the twitter of birds among the trees, and felt the breath of the morning breeze blowing over the meadows brown. One was safe and asleep in his bed. Who at the bridge would be first to fall? Who that day would be lying dead, pierced by a British musket ball? You know the rest in the books you've read. How the British regulars fired and fled. How the farmers gave them ball for ball from behind each fence and farmyard wall, chasing the redcoats down the lane, then crossing the fields to emerge again, under the trees at the turn of the road, and only pausing to fire and load. So through the night rode Paul Revere, and so through the night went his cry of alarm to every Middlesex village and farm, a cry of defiance and not of fear, a voice in the darkness, a knock at the door, and a word that shall echo forevermore. For born on the night wind of the past, through all our history to the last, in the hour of darkness and peril and need, the people awaken and listen to hear the hurrying hoofbeats of that steed and the midnight message of Paul Revere. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow.
You've been listening to the History Things Podcast. Follow the guys on Facebook and Instagram at the History Things Podcast for all the latest news and exclusives. Make sure to also follow Pat and Matt on their social medias at History Things with Pat and at Matt Borders Books. Have a question, comment, or compliment for the show? Send us an email at historythingspodcast@gmail.com. Thanks for listening. We hope you enjoyed the show.